Bill Harlow here again with the latest edition of the Cipher Brief's Cover Stories podcast. Ken Dekleva is no ordinary spy novelist, not by a long shot. He's a doctor who served as a regional medical officer, psychiatrist at the State Department for 14 years. He's currently professor of psychiatry at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas, and also a senior fellow at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. Dekleva brings his special insights to the fore in his third novel, The Russian Diplomat's Wife. It's a fast-paced tale set in Vienna, Austria, about a deep-cover American intelligence officer and a Russian woman. We'll talk to him about the advantages and challenges of bringing a psychiatrist's eye to creative writing, how his real-world career inspired his fiction, and what can be learned about human motivation by observing the characters in The Russian Diplomat's Wife. Let's get underway. Dr. Ken Dekleva, welcome to the Cipher Brief's Cover Stories podcast.
Thank you for hosting me, Bill. It's a pleasure and honor to be on your program.
You know, we get a lot of former intelligence officers who've written espionage fiction joining us, and we get some military veterans and some journalists, but I'm pretty sure you're the first psychiatrist we've had on who's also written a spy novel. And before we start talking about your latest book, The Russian Diplomat's Wife, I wanted to pause a bit and ask you about your real-life story. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of your personal backstory.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm the child of immigrants and who came from the former Yugoslavia during the Cold War. I was born in the U.S., so I grew up hearing about the Cold War, its history, the tragedies, the sufferings. I studied history in college, and I had lived and traveled overseas when I was a kid. I was a very adventuresome youngster. I hitchhiked across what is now Slovenia at the age of 14. I spoke Slovene at the time fluently, and I hitchhiked across the former Yugoslavia when I was 17. And I was a mountaineer and a rock climber. I was actually interviewed in 1972 on the front page of Ljubljana's, Slovenia's leading newspaper, Delo, because I was the first member of the Slovenian Climbing Foundation or Federation, and did some first ascents with some Slovene colleagues. So I had a lot of wanderlust and interest in cultures. And then I got diverted for many years, went to medical school, pre-med studies, medical school, residency in psychiatry. But that curiosity about foreign cultures and languages never left me, and a desire to serve overseas came through because of a mentor I had named Dr. Gerald Post, who was a psychiatrist at CIA, who founded their leadership profiling center. I worked with him in the late 90s when I was an academic in Dallas. And then right around after 9/11, I joined the State Department, and they told me my first post was Moscow. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I later ended up doing a second assignment in Moscow, so a total of 5 years. And then I served in New Delhi, Mexico City, Vienna, Austria, and London, and one tour in Washington. And these were regional jobs where I traveled all over the world. So I wanted to find a way. When I retired, everyone said, you have all these interesting experiences. You should write a book, an autobiography. But that to me seemed boring, and fiction offered a more creative way to draw on all these places, experiences, and fascinating people that I've met. So that's how the ideas for the novels came about.
Well, you know, when you think about it, background as a psychiatrist may be a perfect preparation for writing spy thrillers, since you have insights into the way people think and act and their motivations. And so I imagine that it plays heavily into the fiction writing that you do.
It certainly does, Bill. And the spy novels that I've written are different from a traditional spy novel, which are often written by many of the ones you've hosted and reviewed are former case officers, including my dear friend Jim Lawler, who's written an excellent new novel, The Traitor's Tale. And they write about their experiences, or you have other colleagues of mine and friends who've come from a more paramilitary special forces background, like James Steiskal or J.R. Seeger. I can't write about their worlds, even though I know people in those worlds, because I didn't live those worlds. A writer has to write what they've lived. And in essence, spying or recruiting agents as case officers do, whether they're Americans or Israelis or Chinese or Russians, is really about human relationships and human psychology. So I feel that's what I know about that. And as a psychiatrist, it's really interesting. You have something in common with case officers who form very intense, trusting, close relationships with people whose lives may depend on them, and know them in a certain way very deeply, but don't really know them. Like they've never had them over at their house for dinner. So there are boundaries. And a psychiatrist is similar to that. Patients tell us their most intimate secrets every day. I'm a practicing psychiatrist. And yet I know a piece of them, but not all of them. But psychology is very, very important in the espionage business. And I've talked to a lot of people who were case officers during my career, got to know them very, very well, dear friends, and ones who have retired. And I think they would all agree with that statement, that it's all about human relationships and psychology and where people meet. It's a lot about the mind.
And as you said, you're still practicing in your profession as a psychiatrist, and you also work for the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, which is another interesting twist and aspect to your multifaceted career.
Yes, I've done leadership profiling for many years, as I mentioned, with Dr. Post, the late Dr. Post in the 90s, where we published and presented profiles of Dr. Radovan Karadzic. I translated his poetry because I speak fluent Serbian, and the late Slobodan Milosevic. And while I was in government, I really couldn't do this kind of work easily. But then when I finished my government career in 2016, I wanted to write about Vladimir Putin. And then later people encouraged me to write about Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un. So that's how I got noticed by the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. And they named me a senior fellow several years ago, and I've enjoyed collaborating with them, with David Firestein, the CEO, who's a former China expert with the U.S. Department of State and was one of the best Chinese language speakers in the department. He's been doing China things for about 40 years. So I've enjoyed that part of my work as well.
I didn't know Gerald Post in my time at the agency, but he was legendary there for the work that he had started about leadership profiles, and that continued on. It remains, as far as I know, an important function at the agency. And I know I've heard that presidents and senior officials in government really cherish the work that they get in helping them understand foreign leaders, what makes them tick, not just, what are they doing and why are they doing, but what is their part of their background, which motivates them in the same way that characters in your book are motivated by different influences. So that's a critical part of the work that's done by those people within the intelligence community.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I enjoy doing that kind of work, and have written a lot for the Cipher Brief, and I'm pleased to tell your audience my work has been read at the highest levels of not only our government, but other governments. I had a profile that I wrote for the Cipher Brief about President Putin of Russia a couple of years ago, and I found it had been translated and edited, and additional photos had been added, and the parts they didn't like, they edited out. And they changed the title and said, American Psychiatrist Praises President Putin's Leadership Skills. So these are read at different levels. It's quite interesting.
And where was that posted in Russian, I presume?
In Russia, in the media.
Yeah, wow. So how do you, with all the other things on your plate, how do you find time for novel writing? And why have you decided to write novels as opposed to writing nonfiction?
Novels are more interesting. It also taps into a part of me that's more creative. When I was a young person, I wrote poetry and short stories. And I actually wrote a short story about 15 years ago about the Cold War, called Postcards from a Cold War. And people who read it liked it and said, you should write a novel. And I sort of put that aside, but then came back to it after I had retired. And I thought, well, retired from the government. And I thought, I'll write a novel when I finally retire, but I'm busier than ever. So I figured I'd better do it now. And I really wanted to capture not only the people, the characters of the novel, and really get deeply into them, but bring my background and training as a psychiatrist into trying to understand the relationships. And the other character in my novel are the places. Like my first novel, which was reviewed in the Cipher Brief several years ago, The Negotiator's Cross, is about a priest, Father Ishmael, who becomes a hostage negotiator and gets drawn into espionage. And a lot of that novel takes place in Mexico, where I lived and traveled extensively as a diplomat, and Bosnia, where I've traveled extensively as a youngster and then later as a diplomat, and Moscow, of course, where I lived for 5 years. So the places become an additional character. I want the reader to feel like they're in those places, like if they're in a historic place or a park or a coffee shop, where espionage officers do their work, where they have their meetings, or a museum. I want them to feel like they're right there.
I've found there's generally two kinds of novel writers. There's the ones who sit down and they write an outline of their whole story from start to finish, and then they fill it all in. And there's others who just sit down and start writing and see where it takes them. Do you fall into either of those categories?
Probably a mix, but more the latter. Like the latest novel, The Russian Diplomat's Wife, I wasn't sure what I was going to write about. After I'd written 2 other novels, I wasn't sure where to go. And I write a lot by inspiration, and I use intuition a lot. That's just who I am. And I had been to Vienna last year. I've had family in Vienna, so I've been traveling to Vienna since the late 70s, once or twice a year. And I also served in Vienna as a diplomat for 2 years. So I know Vienna well. And I still go there about twice a year. And I had been in this museum and seen this painting. And I thought, maybe I need to write another novel. And it sort of just clicked. And I was sitting outside and relaxing and having a Cuban cigar and a Texas whiskey and looking at the stars. And then it all kind of, the beginning came together. And then there's a sense of an outline, but things change while you're writing. So when I was about a third of the way through the novel, there were plot twists that changed. And I like the novel to have surprises for the reader. But when those happen on the creative part, there's surprises for me because I'm going, how did I get there? I didn't plan it that way, but it kind of just flowed and happened. I love the creative part of writing. Writing is all the writers who you've hosted, I'm sure, would agree, it's kind of an isolating, solitary type of endeavor where you have to spend a lot of time alone. And solitude is interesting because case officers spend a lot of time alone. The really good ones will wait for hours and hours to meet a person after doing their surveillance runs. And they may do that for 10, 12 hours in a place like Moscow or more to have a 2-minute meeting with someone because of the threat. So they spend a lot of time alone and they have to be self-reflective. And psychiatrists, to be good at psychiatry, one of my teachers, who was a brilliant psychoanalyst, we said, how did you learn this? How did you get to be so good at it? He goes, you have to spend a lot of time alone. You have to be comfortable with solitude and with silence. And I've had that as part of my life.
Well, we've reached the point, the biggest challenge for novelists doing interviews is to give a Reader's Digest synopsis of their book without giving away any of the big twists and turns and spoilers. But I'm sure as a experienced novelist now with your third novel, you've mastered the art of telling just enough to lure readers in. So give us an overview of this particular novel.
Well, The Russian Diplomat's Wife has an interesting setting because it's set in Vienna, which is a beautiful traditional city, a very modern city of about 2.5 million people, but it's also maintained its traditions. Anyone who's visited knows that. The culture, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, chocolates, the beautiful churches downtown. It's 15,000 cafes. And so I wanted to set something in Vienna in that sense. Vienna is also a city of spies. An Austrian journalist about 15 years ago, Emil Boba, wrote a book called Die Schattenstadt, which means the city of spies. And Vienna has about 20,000 diplomats posted there from all over the world because they have these UN organizations. And it's thought that 50% of them or more are intelligence officers. And our adversaries have huge presence there, like Iran, China, Russia. Russia has a huge mission there. When I lived in Vienna, my neighbor was an Iranian diplomat. He had a much nicer house than I did. My house was a $10 million house, but his was beyond gorgeous. It was like a palace. And my other neighbor was a Kazakh ambassador. The embassy was there. And there was a big scandal because there was a killing where a Kazakh dissident was supposedly killed and buried in the backyard of the embassy. So Vienna has a lot of intrigue. And you think of the history, the third man and all that. That fits together. But as a psychiatrist, Vienna is also the city of Sigmund Freud. The unconscious is alive and well in Vienna. And the way my novel starts is with a chance encounter in the Leopold Museum, a very famous, beautiful museum that I've been to many, many times, where an American non-official intelligence officer is looking at this painting by Klimt, Death and Life, Tod und Leben, and next to him is a Russian woman. He doesn't know she's Russian, and there's no one else in that large, great hall. For some reason, they have the room all to themselves. So case officers call this the bump, but they planned the bump. But this bump was accidental. And yet Freud would say there are no accidents in the unconscious. So that's how the plot begins. They have this encounter, and the intelligence officer, who has the nickname Copernicus, and all of the agents he recruits are named after planets, notices that the woman is weeping. And he asks her why. And that's how their encounter begins. And then he becomes intrigued by her and she by him. And that leads to further encounters and eventually love and romance. And then really a question of identity, of who is he and who is she. Because what happens early in the plot, he realizes that her name is not what she said it is. And she's married to a Russian intelligence officer, but she doesn't live with him and is on separate diplomatic orders. So that intrigues him, like, who is this person? What's going on here? And he sort of, because he's non-official, he can do things differently than someone in an embassy. And he becomes more intrigued and sort of attempts to reach out to her. And she to him. She sends him a postcard after their meeting, thanking him for his kind words, with a picture of Klimt's painting. So that's how the relationship starts. And the novel sort of flows through that in their travels throughout Europe and his recruitment of his agents, who are named after planets. And then what happens about halfway through, some of his agents start dying or getting murdered. They think it's not a suicide, it's a homicide, or it's not an accidental death, it's a homicide. And that other people become interested, such as the headquarters of CIA become interested. And an important character in the novel, a deep cover Mossad officer, becomes very intrigued and trips over them in their meetings and wonders, who are these people and what are they doing together? And they become interested in, who is this Russian who's an art dealer and travels all over Europe? And that's the other part I wanted. And the American is also an art dealer. The world of art is a great type of place for both of these people, intelligence officers, to develop sources, because art involves culture, but it also involves a lot of money, big money. So especially in a place like Europe, where there's so much history, art collectors or people of wealth, what they call high net worth individuals, family offices. Large corporations will buy art for their offices and studios. So who goes to those kind of showings and galleries and that? People of interest to someone like Copernicus and the Russian woman. So there's a lot of that woven into the plot as well. And the other part that I like is it takes place in different settings in Vienna, like famous cafes like Café Central in the middle of the first district. I recommend it highly. I've been there many times. That's where Trotsky used to hang out when he was plotting the revolution.
Wow.
Or going to the Gloriette at Schönbrunn, the beautiful walk up to the Gloriette, or going to Steinhof, which is a cathedral that also nearby houses a very famous mental hospital. So, or walking in the Vienna woods, or taking walks downtown. That's part of what Vienna's culture is like. But for case officers in Vienna, that's their playground.
Well, it's a fast-paced novel and full of twists and turns and unexpected developments, as one might hope in all good espionage novels. You mentioned that Israel plays an important role in the novel. You were never assigned in Israel, but have you been there as part of your travels as a regional officer? Or?
No, I had never been to Israel. I had met Israeli diplomats and case officers overseas at receptions. And it was very interesting. I met one diplomat at a post once, an Israeli, who had a mentally ill daughter, and he called me up and asked for help and guidance. And one of my bureaucrat bosses said, "You can't talk to this person. They're not official Americans." I said, "You know what? They're allies. It's a human thing to help him out." So he had a daughter who had bipolar illness, pretty severe, and was asking about resources, local resources. So I talked to him for an hour. He was very grateful. I never heard from him again. That's a hard thing for a diplomat or a Mossad officer to deal with. You have a certain stigma and sorrow and pain and challenge that goes with having a teenager who's mentally ill. And I as a psychiatrist, cared for many kids and adolescents of our diplomats overseas, all of the people who are under chief of mission authority. So that includes military, law enforcement, intelligence officers. That was my job. So I had some workings with people here and there, but my first time to Israel was as a religious pilgrim with my church. And that was 2 years ago. And we got out 36 hours before October 7th.
Wow. So it's an example of how you blended your deep personal connections with Vienna and your time there with additional research to broaden the context of the novel, and it all comes through as if you really know these places. So it's a testament to.
Well, it was amazing to go to Israel as a pilgrim for about 11 days and walk to the places. I'm a Catholic that Jesus walked, and it touched me very deeply and very emotionally as a pilgrim, as a Catholic, as a human being. And that wasn't originally the plan to weave that part, the Israeli part, into the novel as deeply as I did. That's one of those things that just kind of happened.
It's interesting. Again, the blend between having a plan when you start out to write the novel and the novel starts to write itself, where you have to fill in the blanks that come to you. Your book has been praised by quite a few intelligence professionals and best-selling authors like Paul Vidich, who called it a cool, knowing, and quietly devastating novel, and even fellow psychiatrist with deep understanding of the intelligence profession, Dr. David Charney. So all of that must be pretty satisfying to you to get validation from lots of different precincts.
Yeah, that was very, very warm, a warm feeling. You get, as my friend Jim Lawler says, these are psychological rewards and dividends. When you have a writer of Paul Vidich's stature, who's a brilliant spy novelist, write what he did and compare me to Alan Furst or Eric Ambler, I'm in pretty good company. Or when you have a legendary intelligence officer like James Styskull, who's also a novelist, or Robert Gorelick, who lived in Europe for decades and is a living legend, talk about the humanity of the novels and that you understand the psychological intricacies. That's really high praise. And David Charney is a dear, dear friend and one of the most brilliant psychiatrists I know. And for your listeners, probably the leading expert in the world on why people betray their country. He's interviewed as a forensic psychiatric expert spies such as Earl Pitts, and he spent over 110 hours interviewing the late Robert Hansen. So David Charney knows his stuff.
Well, it's certainly a testament to the fine work in the book. Are there one or two big takeaways that you would like readers to take from the book about either intelligence gathering or the characters in your novel, things that you were trying to express about the lives they live, the characters live, and how they interact with each other?
I think it's important to see them as human beings. I was actually talking to Dr. Charney about this, and he said one of the things that bothered him about the novel, but then he later appreciated, was that I humanized the Russians. And then the main Russian character and her parents, her late parents, her father in the novel was a former GRU intelligence officer, high-ranking intelligence officer. And her mentor was a high-ranking deep cover SVR officer. And I see them as human beings. And that's really important. And that's true in my profiling work, but in my novels, I have characters that are, quote, the enemy, but I try to humanize them. And I want people to share in that humanism that, I could sit down with if I met a Russian intelligence officer or a Chinese, and I've had dinners where I sat with high-level Russian intelligence officers when I was in Havana, Cuba, smoking cigars and talking to them. And they're all checking each other out. It's like the Cold War, but we're having a mojito, a cigar, talking about our families and where we've lived, and it's kind of like a ballet, a dance, but they're all human beings, and you have to come across as a likable human being. And that's one of the gifts that the best intelligence officers that I've worked with and known, for example, from our country, and one who's been on your program, a legendary guy named Jim Lawler. You have to like people. You have to have a curiosity about people. And I'm a psychiatrist. I like people. I'm curious. I get paid to be nosy. And I get paid to have fantasies. That's the other thing I want to mention about the novels. Because I'm a psychiatrist, there are dreams that each of the characters has that pop up here and there throughout the novels. Mm-hmm. I can't resist dreams. Freud loved dreams. They're the royal road to the unconscious. And as one of my teachers told me, dreams are wish fulfillments. So the dreams are an interesting part of the plot line, and they often have clues. I won't say more.
Well, it comes through in the book, how it all plays together and keeps the reader guessing throughout the novel. Are you planning or working on a fourth novel?
Not yet, but I hope that there will be a fourth novel. I have to think about the place because of my background as a forensic psychiatrist in the 90s, where I specialized in murder and capital murder cases and sexual assault cases, kidnapping. I may do an international crime type thriller that starts in Texas that involves travel to other places. But I want to let this first novel sort of soak in, this current novel soak in, and I hope that readers will enjoy it. The paperback version, the Kindle version's out, paperback version is coming out in about a week.
Well, we'll let it marinate, and we'll look forward to getting the fourth one, your international crime novel, when that time comes. But I want to thank you again for joining us. The book, again, is The Russian Diplomat's Wife by Dr. Ken Dekleva. It's a fast-paced, fun read, and we highly recommend it. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me.